Richard walked silently through the wide corridors of his massive penthouse in New York City, feeling like a wandering ghost inside his own magnificent kingdom. At 45 years of age, he had successfully built a financial empire that many of his peers deeply envied. Yet every single night, he returned to a home where the hollow echo of his own footsteps was his only real companion. The towering walls, the imported European furniture, and the priceless works of art that decorated every corner seemed to mock him with their cold, empty perfection. He had conquered absolutely everything he ever wanted in the competitive business world except the only thing that truly mattered, which was having someone special to share his daily life with. His daily routine had become a self-imposed punishment, a cycle of solitary meals, endless work hours, and sleeping entirely alone in a bed that felt far too large. The high society social gatherings he attended were merely tedious obligations where he faked polite smiles and engaged in superficial conversations that he immediately forgot before even stepping into his private elevator. His employees maintained a strict professional distance that he himself had established many years ago, back when he firmly decided that building emotional walls was much safer than risking inevitable disappointments. Isabella was the only person who had been working for him consistently for 3 whole years, remaining utterly discreet, highly efficient, and almost invisible in her constant attempt not to disturb his peace. She was a woman of 35 years, coming from a simple background in rural West Virginia, who had moved to the bustling metropolis of New York City in search of a better income to financially support her struggling family back home. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Richard was walking down the marble staircase intending to review some corporate documents in his private home office, when something completely unexpected stopped him dead in his tracks. The voice of Isabella drifted out from the spacious kitchen, sounding heavily muffled and trembling, entirely different from the composed professional tone she always maintained when speaking directly to him. Richard froze in the darkened hallway, having absolutely no intention of spying on his employee, yet finding himself completely unable to continue walking away from the raw sorrow echoing through the air. The words reaching his ears were punctuated by the unmistakable sound of someone desperately fighting back tears while speaking urgently on a telephone call. She was talking to her close friend Lucy, her voice carrying a mixture of deep despair and profound shame that only surfaces when life corners a person with absolutely no apparent way out. Richard had never heard Isabella sound like this before, so completely vulnerable, deeply human, and overwhelmingly real, shattering the illusion of the silent, flawless worker she had always been. Richard remained completely still, leaning against the cold wall of the corridor, hiding perfectly within the evening shadows, while trying to process the incredibly bizarre request he had just overheard. Isabella had clearly stated with a desperate tremor in her voice that she urgently needed a boyfriend for tomorrow, a phrase that sounded like it belonged in a cheap afternoon soap opera rather than his pristine penthouse. There was absolutely nothing funny about the absolute terror in her tone, leaving Richard completely stunned and wondering what kind of terrible situation could possibly force an honest woman to beg for such a strange favor. The root of the problem, as Isabella continued to tearfully explain to her friend, was the upcoming wedding of her younger sister, Sophie, an event her rural family had been planning for many long months. The issue was not the wedding itself, but rather the strict conditions her deeply traditional family had imposed, viewing a 35-year-old woman without a male companion as a source of pity and hushed neighborhood gossip. Furthermore, her beloved mother was severely ill with a failing heart, given only a few short months to live, and her absolute final wish was to see her eldest daughter happily protected by a good man before she passed away. As the emotional conversation finally ended with a defeated sigh, Richard felt a strange, long-forgotten sensation stirring deep within his chest, a profound empathy that shattered his carefully constructed emotional barriers. He realized how incredibly blind he had been, walking past her hidden pain every single day, while sitting alone in his bubble of extreme privilege and self-inflicted loneliness. He listened to the sound of the telephone being placed down on the counter, followed by a quiet sob, and knew in his heart that this particular night would change the entire course of his empty life. Stepping out of the kitchen while desperately wiping her reddened eyes with her cotton apron, Isabella expected to find the usual silence of the massive apartment, only to freeze in sheer horror upon seeing her wealthy boss standing quietly in the hallway. All the color instantly drained from her warm face, leaving her as pale as a ghost, convinced that her deeply embarrassing private moment had just cost her the only job keeping her family afloat. She immediately took a nervous step backward, her trembling hands instinctively raising as she stumbled over her own words, trying frantically to apologize for bringing her personal domestic dramas into his pristine professional sanctuary. Instead of delivering a harsh reprimand or maintaining his usual icy distance, Richard raised a gentle hand in a calming gesture, deeply aware that any sudden movement might cause her to completely break down. He looked at the subtle worry lines around her eyes, the rough texture of her hard-working hands, and realized she was carrying an invisible mountain of heavy responsibilities that he had completely ignored for 3 entire years. Speaking with a softness that thoroughly surprised both of them, he assured her that she did not need to apologize at all, confessing that he had accidentally overheard her desperate plea and wanted to understand more. Taking a deep breath to steady her rapidly beating heart, Isabella leaned against the kitchen counter, finally dropping the rigid professional mask she had worn for so long in his presence. She explained how her father was a strict, old-fashioned man from the deep country of West Virginia, firmly believing that an unmarried woman of her age was a tragic failure that brought silent shame upon the household. She had sacrificed her own youth, her romantic life, and her personal dreams to move to the city, sending almost every single dollar she earned back home to pay for her dying mother's expensive medical treatments. Isabella continued to explain that going to the wedding completely alone meant facing endless pitying looks and uncomfortable questions, which would only cause her fragile mother even more unnecessary distress during her final days. She had desperately tried to ask 2 male acquaintances in the city to accompany her as a favor, but both had rudely declined, leaving her with absolutely no options and the terrifying prospect of ruining her sister's perfect day. The sheer irony of having to completely fake a happy romantic relationship just to provide genuine peace to her dying mother was a cruel burden that was currently crushing her gentle spirit. Hearing these heartbreaking details directly from her trembling lips dismantled the last remaining walls surrounding Richard's isolated heart, filling him with a heavy sense of guilt for his past indifference. He stood completely silent for several long moments, his mind racing as he processed the profound unfairness of her situation, deeply moved by the incredible strength she displayed in the face of such overwhelming familial pressure. He simply told her to get some rest, wishing her a good night with an unprecedented warmth that left Isabella feeling deeply confused, yet strangely comforted, as she quickly retreated to her small maid's quarters. Retreating to his lavish bedroom, Richard found himself entirely unable to sleep, spending the dark hours staring blindly at the glittering city lights of New York, while his mind wrestled with a completely irrational idea. He thought about his own miserable experiences, attending high society weddings, completely alone, dodging intrusive questions about his bachelorhood while pretending his massive wealth made up for the freezing void in his personal life. He realized that both he and Isabella were prisoners of different kinds of loneliness, And for the very first time in decades, he felt a burning desire to do something entirely selfless for another human being. When the morning sun finally began to filter through the tall glass windows, Richard walked back down to the kitchen, finding Isabella already nervously preparing his morning coffee with visibly shaking hands. He sat down at the granite table, a highly unusual gesture that immediately caught her off guard, and gently asked her to stop working for just a moment and listen to what he had to say. He confessed that he had spent the entire night thinking about her impossible dilemma, empathizing deeply with the crushing weight of family expectations and the exhausting charade of pretending everything was perfectly fine. Looking directly into her tired eyes with absolute sincerity, Richard made an offer that completely defied all logic, professional boundaries, and his own highly calculated nature. He softly proposed that if she still desperately needed someone to accompany her to the rural wedding and pretend to be her loving partner, for just one single day, he would willingly be that man for her. Isabella stared at him in absolute paralyzed shock, her coffee cup rattling against the saucer as she struggled to comprehend why a New York millionaire would ever offer to pose as a fake boyfriend for his humble cleaning lady. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere inside the luxurious penthouse shifted dramatically as Richard and Isabella spent their evenings carefully constructing a believable backstory for their completely fictional romantic relationship. They agreed to tell her family that they had met 6 months ago when Richard was hiring specialized contractors for a massive renovation project, and she had kindly recommended some honest workers from her rural hometown. They spent hours practicing casual conversation, figuring out exactly how to hold hands naturally, and deciding on the appropriate level of affection a couple of 6 months should publicly display without raising any unnecessary suspicion. On the morning of the wedding, Richard deliberately dressed down, choosing a simple, well-tailored dark suit that looked respectable but lacked the intimidating aura of his usual $2,000 designer business attire. Isabella emerged from her room wearing a modest but incredibly beautiful navy blue dress she had purchased with her own hard-earned savings, her long hair cascading naturally around her shoulders in a way that made Richard's breath catch in his throat. As they met in the grand foyer, they looked at each other with a completely new perspective, silently acknowledging the massive leap of faith they were both taking as they stepped out of the building together. The journey from New York City to the quiet heart of West Virginia took nearly 6 hours, watching the dense concrete jungle gradually transform into rolling green hills and winding dusty country roads. Isabella spent the majority of the drive nervously twisting her fingers together, absolutely terrified that her sharp-eyed relatives would instantly see through their fragile web of lies and expose the entire embarrassing charade. Richard drove his most inconspicuous vehicle smoothly, offering constant reassurance in a calm, steady voice, reminding her that they simply needed to act like two adults who cared for one another, which was not entirely a lie anymore. Throughout the long drive, Richard found himself genuinely captivated by the simple, profound beauty of the rural landscape, completely unlike the towering glass structures and endless traffic jams he was normally accustomed to. Isabella proudly pointed out her old elementary school, the small grassy park where she used to play as a young child, and the humble grocery store where she worked her very first part-time job. Richard listened with intense fascination, realizing that learning about her humble origins was far more interesting and emotionally rewarding than any million-dollar corporate negotiation he had ever successfully closed. When they finally arrived at the family property, a modest wooden house surrounded by a blooming flower garden, a sudden wave of genuine anxiety washed over Richard's chest. The air was thick with the delicious scent of homemade apple pie, roasted meats, and the loud, joyous chatter of dozens of relatives dressed in their Sunday best, completely overwhelming his usually composed senses. he realized with a sudden jolt of pure panic that he desperately wanted these simple, honest people to genuinely accept him deeply, fearing that he might somehow ruin this perfect day for the woman standing beside him. A fragile woman with graying hair and incredibly kind eyes immediately emerged from the bustling crowd, her physical weakness obvious, yet radiating an immense maternal warmth that required absolutely no formal introduction. Martha Isabella's beloved mother completely ignored Richard's politely extended hand, and instead pulled the tall millionaire into a tight emotional embrace, softly whispering a tearful thank you into his ear for taking such good care of her precious daughter. Richard was completely disarmed by the raw sincerity in the older woman's voice, feeling an unexpected lump form in his throat as he gently hugged her back silently, vowing not to let her down. Her strict father Frank approached next, offering a firm, calloused handshake that spoke volumes of his lifetime of hard manual labor, welcoming Richard into their family circle with a curt but respectful nod. Immediately following him was Aunt Grace, notoriously the most curious woman in the entire county, accompanied by a new face, Cousin Chloe, a sharp-witted young woman studying journalism who looked at Richard with highly suspicious, narrowed eyes. Cousin Chloe immediately began grilling Richard about his exact business ventures and his intentions with her older cousin, trying actively to find holes in their carefully rehearsed story, while Aunt Grace asked 50 questions about his life in the big city. Despite the initial awkwardness and the intense interrogation, Richard handled every single question with remarkable patience, charming humility, and a self-deprecating humor that completely surprised Isabella. He respectfully deflected Cousin Chloe's skepticism by shifting the focus back to how incredibly lucky he felt to have met someone as hard-working and selfless as Isabella, bringing a genuine blush to her cheeks. Seeing the man she had served coffee to for 3 years effortlessly winning over her stubborn traditional family filled Isabella's heart with a profound, confusing warmth that felt dangerously close to real affection. The wedding ceremony took place in a beautifully rustic wooden church, located just a few miles down the road, perfectly decorated with wild daisies, and filled to the brim with incredibly joyous friends and family. Richard sat respectfully in the very first row, right beside Isabella, watching with a gentle smile as her younger sister Sophie walked down the narrow aisle, radiating absolute happiness toward her tearful, loving groom. He could clearly feel the immense emotional weight of the moment. Deeply understanding exactly why Isabella had sacrificed her entire youth and financial stability to ensure her family could experience days exactly like this one. When the emotional vows were finally exchanged, Isabella could no longer hold back her overwhelming tears, silently crying out of pure joy for her sister and a deep, lingering sorrow for her own complicated life. Without a single moment of hesitation, Richard instinctively reached into his pocket and offered her his soft silk handkerchief, a gesture so incredibly natural and intimate that it felt utterly devoid of any theatrical pretense. She whispered a trembling "thank you," looking up into his eyes, and for a fleeting second, the loud world around them completely faded away, leaving only a profound connection that terrified them both. The lively reception was held in the expansive backyard of the family home, illuminated by hundreds of colorful string lights and featuring a local country band that kept the wooden dance floor packed with energetic guests. Richard, a man who typically stood in the quiet corners of elegant galas holding a glass of expensive champagne, suddenly found himself being joyfully dragged onto the makeshift dance floor by a laughing Isabella. He was entirely out of his comfort zone, yet as he pulled her close and followed the upbeat rhythm of the fiddles, he felt a liberating surge of pure, unadulterated happiness he had never known before. Moving perfectly in sync beneath the starry country sky, Richard truly saw Isabella for the magnificent woman. She was entirely stripped of the invisible maid's uniform she wore in his mind for the past 3 years. He watched her effortlessly comfort her weeping mother, playfully twirl her younger cousins, and check on every single guest with a bottomless well of genuine, radiant love that illuminated the entire backyard. He found himself incredibly angry at his own past blindness, wondering how he could have lived in the very same house as this spectacular human being and completely failed to notice her brilliant inner light. Suddenly, the lively music abruptly stopped, and the lead singer playfully announced over the microphone that it was time for the traditional couple's kissing game, demanding that every romantic pair on the dance floor share a passionate embrace. Isabella froze completely, a look of sheer panic washing over her beautiful features, as all her relatives, including the previously skeptical cousin Chloe, turned their eager attention toward the city couple. Richard leaned in quickly, whispering softly against her ear that they just needed a quick, convincing peck to satisfy the roaring crowd, gently cupping her warm face in his large hands to steady her trembling nerves. As their lips gently touched what was supposed to be a brief, theatrical performance, instantly transformed into a powerful emotional collision that knocked the breath completely out of both of their lungs. Time seemed to stand completely still, as the gentle pressure deepened into a kiss filled with months of unspoken tension, raw longing, and the sudden terrifying realization that they were no longer pretending. The noise of the cheering guests, the twang of the country guitars, and the smell of the evening breeze vanished entirely, leaving Richard entirely consumed by the incredibly soft, sweet taste of the woman holding onto his shoulders. The surrounding crowd erupted into loud cheers and enthusiastic whistling, completely satisfied by the undeniable chemistry they had just witnessed, forcing the dazed couple to finally pull away from each other. Isabella's golden brown eyes were blown wide with absolute shock, and a deep, swirling confusion, her chest heaving as she stared up at the wealthy businessman who had just turned her entire emotional world completely upside down. Richard felt his own heart hammering wildly against his ribs, unable to form a single coherent thought, as he realized that the iron fortress he had built around his emotions had just been permanently shattered. Later that beautiful evening, as the festivities finally began to wind down and the newlyweds departed for their honeymoon, Martha quietly approached Richard near the quiet edge of the blooming flower garden. The frail mother looked deeply into his eyes and sincerely thanked him again, confessing that she had seen the way he looked at her daughter during the dance, recognizing the undeniable gaze of a man truly in love. She gently placed her weak hand over his, asking him to always protect Isabella's fragile heart, leaving Richard completely speechless and burdened with the beautiful, terrifying truth that her mother was entirely right. Retreating to the small guest bedroom that the family had lovingly prepared for them, the atmosphere between Richard and Isabella was incredibly thick, with awkward tension and entirely unspoken questions about the earth-shattering kiss. They maintained a highly respectful physical distance on the modest mattress, both staring blindly at the dark wooden ceiling while listening to the loud rhythmic chirping of the crickets outside the open window. Richard finally broke the heavy silence, softly confessing into the darkness that the entire day had been the most genuinely happy experience of his adult life, and it had absolutely nothing to do with acting. The next morning arrived far too quickly, bringing with it a massive breakfast feast prepared by Martha, followed by tearful hugs and prolonged farewells that made Isabella's heart ache with bittersweet joy. The return journey back to the towering skyline of New York City was filled with a dense, contemplative silence, the magical bubble of the rural wedding slowly popping as the harsh reality of their separate lives loomed ahead. Isabella stared blankly out the passenger window, internally preparing herself to quietly slip back into her invisible role of cleaning the marble floors, deeply terrified of losing the wonderful connection they had just shared. Pulling the heavy vehicle into a deserted rest stop along the highway, Richard turned off the engine, turned completely toward Isabella, and firmly stated that she could no longer work as his domestic employee. The words struck her like a physical blow, draining the color from her face as she immediately panicked about losing her steady income and failing her sick mother, who relied heavily on her monthly financial support. Richard quickly raised his hands, desperately clarifying that he was not abandoning her financially, but rather that he absolutely refused to ever treat her as a subordinate again after seeing her true, magnificent spirit. Seeing the sheer terror in her eyes, he softly explained his true intentions, offering to completely fund her long-forgotten dream of studying nursing while they carefully explored a genuine romantic relationship on equal footing. Isabella was overwhelmed by the incredible generosity and the immense risk of his proposal, fearing that the massive gap in their social classes would eventually destroy the fragile bond they had just formed. After a long, emotional conversation filled with tears and honest fears, she finally agreed to take a chance on him, promising to proceed slowly and honestly as they navigated this completely uncharted territory together. Their very first official date took place later that week at a cozy, dimly lit Italian restaurant hidden away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the prying eyes of Richard's wealthy business associates. The owner of the restaurant, a warm-hearted man named Mario, immediately recognized the genuine spark between them and treated them like honored family, bringing out his finest homemade dishes and telling them stories of his own long marriage. Under Mario's cheerful encouragement, the awkwardness quickly melted away, allowing them to talk for hours about their deepest fears, their childhood dreams, and the beautifully unexpected way their completely different lives had finally collided. However, their blooming romance faced its very first major test just a few weeks later, when Richard was heavily pressured to attend a highly publicized charity gala filled with New York's wealthiest elite. He enthusiastically invited Isabella to accompany him, completely failing to understand her immediate panic and deep-seated fear of being brutally judged by high society as nothing more than the millionaire's former cleaning lady. She tearfully refused the invitation, pointing out the harsh reality that his wealthy peers would never accept her humble background, forcing a painful wedge of doubt between their rapidly growing feelings for one another. A bitter argument ensued in the kitchen of the penthouse, ending with Isabella locking herself in the guest bedroom while Richard stubbornly attended the glamorous event completely alone, feeling utterly miserable in his expensive tuxedo. Surrounded by superficial conversations and fake smiles, he realized with absolute clarity that none of his immense wealth or social standing meant anything if he could not share it with the woman who held his heart. He abruptly left the gala hours early, driving recklessly back to the penthouse with a burning determination to prove to Isabella that their love was far stronger than any societal prejudice or malicious gossip. Returning to the silent penthouse, he found Isabella sitting quietly on the balcony, wrapping her arms around herself against the chilly night air, her eyes red from crying over their seemingly impossible situation. Richard immediately dropped to his knees before her, taking her trembling hands in his own, and passionately apologized for his blind ignorance regarding the immense social pressures she was bravely facing. He fiercely promised that he would proudly stand by her side against anyone who dared to judge them, vowing to build a unified front that no amount of elitist snobbery could ever tear down. Over the following few months, Isabella flourished beautifully in her intensive nursing studies, her natural compassion and brilliant mind making her an absolute standout among her peers in the demanding medical program. With Richard's unwavering emotional support, she slowly began attending smaller, more intimate social gatherings with his closest, most trusted friends, discovering that many of them were genuinely kind people who respected her hard work. She learned to hold her head high in elegant dining rooms, realizing that her immense sacrifices for her family gave her a profound inner dignity that no amount of inherited wealth could ever buy. Richard also made genuine efforts to fully integrate into her world, frequently visiting her small apartment, helping her study complex medical terms, and occasionally traveling back to West Virginia to spend quality time with her family. He bonded deeply with her strict father over long walks in the fields, won over cousin Chloe's lingering skepticism by helping her secure a journalism internship, and brought immense joy to Martha's final peaceful days. The rural family completely embraced the wealthy businessman as one of their own, proving that true character completely erased the artificial lines drawn by bank accounts and fancy corporate job titles. On a particularly warm summer night, exactly 1 year after the frantic evening that had changed their lives forever, Richard and Isabella stood together on the sprawling balcony of his Manhattan penthouse. The sparkling city lights stretched out endlessly before them, mirroring the vast, beautiful possibilities of the future they had fought so incredibly hard to build together, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Isabella leaned comfortably against his broad chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace that she had never experienced in her entire life of constant struggle. Turning to face him completely, her golden brown eyes shining with unshed tears of pure joy, Isabella softly told him that she was finally ready to permanently let go of all her lingering insecurities and fears. She thanked him for truly seeing the woman she was beneath the maid's uniform, for believing in her nursing dreams, and for giving her the incredible courage to finally accept that she deserved to be loved unconditionally. She confessed that, for the very first time in her difficult life, she felt entirely safe, cherished, and ready to embrace the wonderful future he had so patiently offered her from the very beginning. Richard gently reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his own eyes brimming with an overwhelming emotion that he no longer felt any need to hide behind a mask of stoicism. He told her that she was the one who had truly saved him, pulling him out of a freezing ocean of isolation and teaching him the true, immeasurable value of compassion, sacrifice, and family. With a voice trembling with absolute certainty, he declared his profound, everlasting love for her, asking her to stay by his side not as his employee, or even just his girlfriend, but as his equal partner in life. The passionate kiss they shared under the starlit New York sky was not an act of desperation or a performance for a crowd, but a deeply sacred promise between two souls who had finally found their way home. They had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of extreme social differences, personal insecurities, and external judgments, emerging infinitely stronger and completely united in their shared vision for a beautiful shared tomorrow. They knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but as long as their hands remained tightly woven together, there was absolutely nothing in the world that could ever tear their magnificent love apart. Reflecting on this incredible journey between two people from completely different spheres of existence, we uncover a profoundly beautiful truth about the human experience and the deeply unpredictable nature of destiny. Throughout the course of our lives, especially as we gather years of wisdom and quiet observation, we often build incredibly thick emotional walls to protect ourselves from the inevitable pains, disappointments, and harsh judgments of the modern world. However, this story serves as a gentle, powerful reminder that the true essence of a meaningful life is never found in the accumulation of material wealth, towering social status, or the safety of isolation, but rather in the courageous vulnerability of opening our hearts to the suffering and hopes of others. When we dare to truly listen to those around us, looking past the superficial labels of class or profession, we often discover extraordinary spirits capable of teaching us the deepest lessons about unconditional love and selfless sacrifice. It takes immense bravery to step out of our comfortable routines and extend a hand of genuine empathy, yet it is precisely within these unscripted, highly vulnerable moments of human connection that our greatest blessings are born. May we always remember that no matter our age or past experiences, it is never too late to tear down our walls, embrace the unexpected, and allow the transformative power of sincere love to completely rewrite the remainder of our precious stories.